Uh, Welcome everybody to the last dialogue of the 2021 very special edition of Afropean Bridges. I'm Shaul Bassi, and on behalf of the co-organizer Vittorio Longhi and Ijaba Shego, I want to give a warm welcome to Johny Pitts. Johny, welcome back.
Thank you, Shaul. It's great to be here. Very fond memories of being in Venice with you a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Johny Pitts was a guest of honor in our 2019 edition of Afropean Bridges. And that was just a few months before the publication of his groundbreaking book, Afropean. And of course, you know, the title of the book explains why he is such an important intellectual presence for us. But before we start a conversation, since this, as I mentioned, is our last conversation of this series that has been entirely online, let me briefly renew my thanks to all the people who have participated in this edition, the co-organizer Vittorio Longhi and Ijaba Shego, and all the people who have been in the previous dialogues that remain available for viewers, and so in alphabetical order: Sulaiman Adonia, Christina Alifara, Saba Anglana, Mamadou Ba, Yuri Boychenko, Peter Brathwaite, Alessandra Di Maio, Esther Elisha, Bernardine Evaristo, Theo Imani, Kumba Kane, Lydia Kachaturian, Vittorio Longhi, Francesca Melandri, Masa Mengiste, Dunia Mijatovic, Giselle Musabimana, Alex Nkosi, Kelechi Nwaneri, Chinedu Nwokefor, Isi Ozondu, Chiara Piaggio, Johny Pitts, Ijaba Shego, Sami Chak, and Francesco Vacchiano. Last but not least, I want to thank publicly and warmly Barbara Del Mercato and Luca Pietrini, that from the backstage have made this conversation possible. Johny Pitts, as you explain in your fabulous book, you have not coined the word Afropean yourself, but I think we can safely say that you've given more depth and breadth to the word than anyone before. And I want to start from the interesting fact that the original edition is Afropean, and the Italian edition is Afropei, that puts a plural in the word, you know. And I think this is an interesting cue, because you explained that this journey across Black Europe is one that reveals there is no one Black Europe. There are many Black Europes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I actually began this journey feeling a little bit overconfident, really sure that I knew what it meant to be Black. I knew what Europe was, you know, and then very quickly everything became a kind of abstraction, you know, and I kind of didn't know what those things really meant anymore. And it was almost like this, through the process of making this journey at the street level, not in terms of studying it and researching it, but encountering the many different people, you know, that I met on this journey, everything was challenged, and so everything that I thought fell apart, and it was a process of trying to then piece it back together, not in a kind of in a way that was monolithic, but rather, you know, embrace this notion of a kind of a bricolage of Blackness, you know, these various fragments that didn't fit perfectly together, but at the same time, when you looked at it as a whole, it wasn't entirely amorphous either, you know. It was there was a possibility for solidarity there that I found in the end. But yeah, certainly I describe this book sometimes as a kind of happy failure, you know. It was everything that I started out with fell apart, and then I had to build it together to make something new.
Well, yeah. Well, I don't think it's a failure, but certainly it's a very felicitous book, a very important book. I've written down a few definitions that you offer of Afropean, and at some point you say that the Afropean term is a complicated, integrated form of Blackness in Europe that refused to be bogged down by stereotypes. And one of the many things you do in this book, which I will briefly describe for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, is that you really travel in different countries and cities throughout Europe to find places, to find memorable people, memories of famous people, but mostly ordinary people that make a living in different parts of Europe. You've described yourself as a visitor to strange places at strange times, occupied by strange people, which is, I think, a fantastic definition. You're a wanderer, you're a flaneur, and I like to start by something very topical. In Italian mainstream culture now, there is this sense that we are threatened by the so-called cancel culture. But I think that your book shows that we already live in a cancel culture, that European culture is a culture that by and large has canceled traces of its colonial past, of its Black presence, of African presence. And so you do a lot to bring back to visibility, to sing into visibility this Black presence.
Yeah, when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression, and I think that's what we're seeing with this cancel culture debate at the moment. I mean, I know someone who was really at the heart of that debate, the writer Thomas Chatterton Williams, who was one of the original people who penned the letter for Harper's Bazaar that really kind of brought this notion into the mainstream. And I like Thomas, but I disagree with him on a lot of things, and I think the way he is very cynical about what he terms as woke culture, which is responsible for cancel culture. I think it's dangerous, because I actually think that even Thomas himself, who is an intellectual, he might not describe himself as a Black intellectual now, but his father is, African American. I think that actually these people who are on the front line of this debate, who are really trying to push forward a kind of a consciousness, which is where I guess this notion of woke comes from. It's becoming conscious of the legacy of imperialism and of inequality, and trying to address that. I think it's those people on the front line that allow the work, which and I think he's a great writer, Thomas Chatterton Williams, but allows that nuanced work to happen, because they're opening up this space for Black creatives. And so, yeah, I think I'm very wary of this notion of cancel culture, and I understand where it comes from, because I think with social media, sometimes if somebody has posted a slightly suspect tweet 12 years ago, they've been held up for it now, and then and that's a problem. Sometimes I think we should learn in some. I mean, God, if like when I was like in my early 20s, if everything I did was documented, maybe I'd be cancelled. And I really do think that we have to allow people to learn and grow, but at the same time, I think part of that learning and that growth is trying to bring a kind of almost a reckoning to pass. I think it's really important that we're having this debate now, because people used to put all this stuff under the rug, and it, like you were saying, you said something really interesting there. It's true that the great cancel culture really has been European hegemony. That's what has been the cancel culture. I mean, I believe Gloria Wecker, I think she quotes Edward Said when she talks about this notion of the cultural archive, and this cultural archive of Europe, and everything that signifies being European, and how that selects is very selective about what it includes as a part of that cultural archive. And I think the work that I'm doing, the work that you're doing, and many other scholars at the moment, is trying to address the omissions from that cultural archive. Jacques Derrida talks about how archiving is as much a chance to suppress and sublimate history as it is to preserve it. So I think we're trying to address that.
Mm-hmm. And on this topic, you make several references to the absence of Black Europe, I would say, in the educational archive or canon. For instance, you say we have, and you make a comparison with the U.S. We have no Martin Luther Kings or Malcolm X's. We have Frantz Fanons and Stuart Halls, but unlike the way the American dream integrated the civil rights movement into its own mythology, our heroes aren't overtly embedded in the narrative of European history and identity. And I think this is really a key point there. And by the way, I think you also say that as someone who grew up in your generation, that you didn't have any sort of role models that you could identify with that corresponded to your own identity.
No, I guess part of that is because the experience in Europe probably is more based around collective movements rather than that kind of individualism that you get in the United States. But then what does come with that is our civil rights leaders who managed to fight to be a part of you really Martin Luther King is probably one of the first people you'd mention when you think of America, and I don't think it is the same in Europe, and part the book was in a way trying to search for these figures, whether it be Alexander Pushkin or Frantz Fanon, these figures who through their personal lives speak of something much wider, and that's what the book was about in general. Actually, it was I was meeting people, speaking to them about their lives, or encountering people who may be dead now, but encountering them in geographic locations, people like Baldwin and Fanon and even Mobutu, and then using their stories to provide a kind of wider context. So really, Fanon's story talks about the myth making of the Second World War and how people like him were woven out of the myth making of that Second World War. And Pushkin is talking about the kind of the almost nobility that you could find. That in fact there are even members of the British royal family who were related to Pushkin and thus have African ancestry. So it was just to try and really play in the blur that Europe tries to erase so often, trying to really celebrate that blur and bring forward people who might be exemplars of that.
Your example of Pushkin is perfect, because there you show how we don't really need to, let's say, cancel anything. We need to add the African dimension that has been erased, even when it was a central part of a particular cultural canon. And on Frantz Fanon, I found it particularly, among the many poignant and moving parts of this book, that is full of fun, is full of thrill, but is also full of very sad and moving moments, is the moment where you really retell the story of Fanon, who was one of the many African soldiers that made our European freedom possible. And you explain how that was an act of deliberate erasure when, after liberating France, it was almost symbolically important that General de Gaulle would not enter Paris with a black army.
Yeah, exactly. And again, that goes back to that cultural archive. It was important who was seen to have won the Second World War, and that you've got like a free French army that's like 2/3 from the colonies. That doesn't look good. That isn't a part of this myth making of Europe. And you get cases like that all across Black history. I was just speaking with Dr. Olivette Otelli, who's written a great book called African Europeans, which goes even further back, because for me it was really important to try and provide a contemporary context. And it's almost like a great book to then read after Afropean or maybe before Afropean, or at least alongside it, is this book African Europeans, which goes back to before the Renaissance, into the 1600s, and shows this ancient Black presence in Europe. It's as I was encountering this, because some of it I already knew, but a lot of it was just me searching for clues around Europe and meeting with people and them telling me small things and saying, "No, you should go here, you should go there." And then when I was along in Toulon, finding that Frantz Fanon was there, was in Toulon when Paris was liberated, and then discovering that story, because we all know about his theory and most of us have read Black Skin, White Masks or The Wretched of the Earth, and know his role, especially in Algeria. But for me, it was important. I almost wanted to claim him as a Second World War hero, but an alternative Second World War hero, because I just think it's important to complicate all these things that we think we know so well. I mean, in the UK, it's not even just a question of blackness. Sometimes, like in the UK, we didn't know that 24 million Russian men and women, actually, died in the Second World War. We didn't hear anything about Russia's contribution at school, and so even there's a real myth making that excludes. I mean, I guess it emerges from the Cold War. And the Cold War is another thing that was interesting for me, is to look at the potential solidarities that were kind of almost crushed very often by the CIA and by Britain and by the so-called allies. Some of the African independence movements that were funded by the USSR. That's another alternative vision that for me was really interesting to think about, because of course, being from the UK, it was just Russia were the bad guys. We were taught to really to fear Russia. And when I was there, I noticed I was carrying a lot of that baggage with me, despite thinking of myself as somebody who was a critical thinker. I realized how much sort of cultural baggage, and that's where this notion, like, of decolonizing is important for me, is that notion of decolonizing the mind, because there were so many problematic elements that were woven into my psyche as a child growing up, who was wanting to take part in Britain, that I've had to really deeply try and untangle, and writing this book was a big part of that process.
Yeah. On a personal note, I want to add that when my father was liberated by the Allied armies in Rome in 1945, his first personal memory as a child was to see a soldier who was wearing a turban, because he was probably a sick soldier in the army. But all the World War II movies we grew up with, this myth making that you explained, didn't include any such presence. It was very much the Anglo-American army that sort of literally whitewashed the reality. But myth making, I think it's an important theme that you deal with, and also because I want to touch some sort of less comfortable things that you bring up. For instance, at some point you say that in many comparisons, analogies between African American culture and Afropean culture, you says that U.S. exports its blackness, and African Europe is not exported, is not made popular.
Yeah, I think that comes from the fact that Africans were literally brought over to the United States as commodities, and then America, the American dream, has a way of commodifying everything. And so, like, African American culture has been really commodified. I think it's something to do with capitalism, the way even in most children of my generation will have really been. So yeah, Africans were brought over as commodities to the United States, and African American culture has been commodified ever since, and so, like, I think for people of my generation, black identity was woven up with Nike Air Jordans and hip hop culture and so, like, through kind of that American cultural hegemony, you have blackness that came with it and that was exported through music and through literally trainers, through consumption. We consumed African American culture, but again, it's another one of those kind of contradictory things where it seems like a negative thing on the one hand, but what it did do is it meant that when anybody went to America, they were never surprised to see black people on the streets of America. And I think still to this day, when people come to Europe, my cousins from the States will come over to Europe. They're even surprised to see black people in somewhere like France, never mind Italy or Holland or Sweden. And I think that's all part of this kind of way that in some ways, I think due to colonialism, and of course, Europe is intimately tied up in slavery as well. Let's not forget. But I think that the nature of colonialism, which really underpins the kind of relationship between members of the African diaspora and white Europeans, colonialism had a way of almost destroying by swamping blackness up, and almost acting like it didn't exist. I mean, the first thing, and I learned this from Frantz Fanon, the first words that Fanon learned to say in Martinique was "Je suis français," I am French. So the first thing you had to do was discount your blackness, discount your otherness, and take part in Europe, and of course, for so many people, that's just not feasible. They don't know how to take part, but more importantly than that, they're not allowed to take part, and then you have one or two key success stories who are allowed to take part, and they're the people sometimes you hear about. But even then, I feel like blackness really is woven out of, again, the mythology of Europe in a way that it's not in the States.
Yeah, great. On this note, of course, throughout the book, it's amply clear that racism is a paramount problem in Europe, but there is also that sort of more subtle form of danger, which is what you call corporate multiculturalism. So there is a multiculturalism that is, in fact, a kind of commodification of difference that doesn't really help, because it highlights some sort of ghetto glamour or success stories, but it lives in the dark all the ordinary people and experiences that you describe.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. When you think of, even the current conservative government that we have in the United Kingdom, and the conservative government have been responsible for these austerity measures and these awful, the way that the Windrush generation have been treated, the vilification of Islam and Muslims, and it's just sort of amazing to me how I think this current government are the most ethnically diverse government in the history of Britain. People but you have people like Priti Patel at the head of vilifying Black Lives Matter protesters, and so it just shows you that really what you find in the government isn't multiculturalism. Actually, I think Gary Young said this. They're actually all from the same culture, and that is Eton and Cambridge, and like there are these few success stories, the sons and daughters of rich people who've managed to go to these schools, who get indoctrinated into this very into these spaces of Western imperialism, and get indoctrinated into that way of thinking. And then, that is not something we can necessarily celebrate, because these people aren't looking out for the everyday Black communities in Europe. And I draw a lot from the work of Marc Augier as well, when he talks of things like non-places, and how there are these spaces that some people are allowed to enter if you have a passport, if you're on the board of a company, you can meet up. That you might get somebody who's from Nigeria, and somebody who's from South Korea, and somebody who is from India, all meeting up to discuss business. But ultimately, that the business they're discussing usually empowers the structures that are in place already, that ultimately subjugates Black people. So it's really tricky, and I completely agree with that. And I think that's where the left really failed, especially in the United Kingdom under Tony Blair. There was this veneer of inclusion, this veneer of multiculturalism, all the while actually underneath it all, multiculturalism, the real stuff that was on the streets, was being undermined. Where you could find multiculturalism at drum and bass raves, they were made illegal. Pirate radio stations were shut down. The foreign secretary at the time was David Blunkett, was actually the MP for my local area, was saying how Britain was being swamped by immigrants. So it's complicated, but I'm very wary of that notion of corporate multiculturalism, and how and how it can not really chime with what's going on the streets. And that was why I wanted to tackle Black Europe from the street up, outside of any areas of officialdom.
Yeah, and another way which your book could be described is that really a celebration of Black creativity against the multiple constraints of society and culture. So not just the success stories of pop culture, but really the local creativity that you find expressed in different places.
Yeah, I've been playing around with this notion of the B-side, and I think I spoke of it when I did my talk in Venice in 2019. I was just beginning this idea, and I was speaking with a friend and this producer, Mad Professor, who was part of the really multicultural Bristol scene that produced Massive Attack, and he worked with Massive Attack a lot. And he was talking about how they would buy a record for the B side, not the A side, which was the official version. There'd be like an instrumental or a different version on the B side, and they would call it the version, And then he was saying, like, actually, the people would buy this B side, look for this B side rather than the A side. It was almost like a B side culture where you have, the kind of radio stations. Again, there were usually pirate radio stations that would play this music, the tower blocks that would broadcast the radio stations because you could get the best signal. And the whole culture around it was a kind of B-side. And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of how that might almost apply to a lot of the Black culture that I'm interested in, is this notion of something that emerges from outside of the official narrative, and how that often comes with a lot of creativity, and that manages to survive. And this is actually something that there's a long tradition of this in the African American canon, where you have everybody from Tupac and his poem, the Concrete Rose, and Benny King, A Rose in Spanish Harlem, and Aretha Franklin, A Rose is Still a Rose. And it's this notion that, isn't it amazing that this rose can grow through a crack in the sidewalk when it's unloved? That there's a garden over there where the rose is attended to and asked to flourish. But then, isn't it amazing how even if this rose, and it might be a little bit crooked or dusty, it managed to still emerge from a crack in the sidewalk. And I'm really interested in that because I'm from that, and that isn't the only expression of Blackness. As I mentioned, there are Black scholars who went to Eton and are from a very different tradition, but the kind of Black identity that I find useful, and that kind of chimes with working class politics and what might have been called back in the day third world politics, is that notion of the rose that blooms through a crack in the sidewalk, the B side. I'm really interested in the B side to counter the A side.
Yeah, that's great. There's also, I think, a lot of vignettes, a lot of moments where you show how even to be a progressive, even to be a militant, is a kind of privilege that is not given to Black people. There is a very special moment where you describe yourself being in Berlin at a sort of anti-fascist demonstration, and you realize how it's great to have anti-fascist demonstrators, but you see how race plays into that, because those people have a certain space of maneuver. They can contest, they can protest, they can even be violent without fearing expulsion, discrimination, and so I think that is particularly a sort of eye-opening moment in the book.
That's I'm glad that you said that, because actually it's moments like that I think that's where you can find the real value, I hope, of Afropean. I heard an interview recently with Les Back, and he was saying that something that has served him well throughout his life is to explore the counterintuitive. So anything where you think, oh, that's not what I was expecting. If you investigate that usually yields incredible results, and that's what I found on this journey. Is I started out I had this real idea of what I would find. And, you know, initially maybe I tried to, anything that didn't chime with my idea, I tried to brush it off. And then suddenly I realized that no, this is where the beauty of the book is. Everything that I couldn't see, and everything that contradicts received wisdom is actually what's really interesting to explore, to this everydayness that can't exactly fit into a perfect theory or can't, you know, doesn't sit perfectly well on a sociologist's desk, you know. And so that was one of those moments where, you know, it was like, okay, I'm with these left-wing anti-fascists, and this should be my home. And it didn't feel exactly like home. And I started to question what it all meant, actually. You know, there was like an after party, and it was almost like they were having too much fun, you know, whereas I feel like, you know, very often when you see members of the Black community demonstrating, it's because, you know, we've lost a member of our community, or this is not fun. Nobody really wants to be doing this. People don't really want to be tearing up neighborhoods. Whereas I saw these kind of, it almost looked like kind of a bunch of art students thinking, yeah, great, you know, let's do this. And they kind of knew that ultimately, you know, they'd be rescued by the system. There was an Antifa helpline, and you know, ultimately, in the end, I was like you were just saying, it's better than that they're there than not there, you know. And there is a rise in neo-Nazism in Germany, and in the end, you know, if you have to make something seem cool for people to take part, that and to care about things that they wouldn't ordinarily necessarily care about, then maybe you have to turn it into a big party. I don't know, but certainly it was something that I really wanted to explore, is this complication where I thought, okay, these are the people on the right side of the argument, but then it doesn't necessarily resonate with where I'm from. Put it that way.
Absolutely, and you know, you describe yourself as an Afropean wanderer, as a flaneur, and I think by doing that, you also, in a way, point out how the flaneur, who is of course a seminal image in European culture, entails the fact that the traditional flaneur is by definition kind of invisible. It doesn't stand out, and the Afropean flaneur is not someone who can, unless, you know, is in a particular ethnic neighborhood. It will always be someone who will stand out. You know, being a flaneur is being part of a majority that, in a way, challenges itself. But your anecdote of being, you know, walking the streets of Moscow and see cars stopping, and or the mirror image of the anti-fascist demonstration, I think, is that of the African students that you describe, who have always to be very hardworking, very dedicated, very committed, or like dropouts. That in fact, one of the issues is that an African person in Europe, or an Afropean, is always in a way almost forced to perform certain roles, because they wouldn't have the same kind of options available to the white majority.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really interesting, something that I've been fascinated with, is after the book has come out, the chapters kind of talk to each other, and people are seeing things there that even I haven't seen, you know, that you can make connections between the chapters. And I've never heard someone say that before, that actually, if you compare what's happening in Berlin with what's happening in Moscow, and the type of lives that the students are having in each city, when you've got the African students that are in Russia and then the white students in Berlin, it's a very different student experience. And the feeling is that the African students in Russia, they didn't have time for that, you know, for the kind of, you know, smashing things up, and they you know, they were out there to survive, and very often having to be the provider for many people, you know, for an entire family, for friends, for whole communities sometimes, and that comes with a lot of pressure. And so and as you mentioned, and this is what I tried to explore in the book, is that pressure either turns somebody into that provider, where they're just working all hours and kind of not doing anything else, and just, you know, or or they drop out and they're ashamed, and they get cut loose. And actually in Berlin, I did meet a couple of people at this place called Yarm, which is the young, African artist market in Berlin, who were exactly examples of that, who came to Europe to try and make their fortunes, and it never happened. And now they're too embarrassed. They can't go back with empty-handed, with empty pockets. So they stay in Europe, living hand to mouth. And when that wasn't the plan was to make some money and nourish their own communities, and it just didn't work out that way. So they kind of get caught adrift.
Yeah. Since you mentioned responses to your book, tell us something about how this book has been sort of welcomed in different parts of Europe. That'd be maybe vis-a-vis the UK or.
I've been really, really pleased with how it's been received. It's been broadly a really positive experience, but I think in a way, something else that's been amazing is how many people have spotted gaps in the book, because of course this book, it could only be so long, and I mean the chapter in Italy is pretty much non-existent.
I'm getting there, so save that for later.
Okay, yeah, we'll say that. Yeah, so and in Spain, and across a lot of Eastern Europe, there was only so much I could fit in. Already, I came back with about nearly 350,000 words, and I had to cut that then down to maybe 100,000 words, and. I even cut out. I wrote a whole chapter about London, and I had to cut that out because I thought, well, a lot has been written about London, so maybe I can cut that out. But so yeah, one thing that's been really amazing is people have responded well to the book, and then kind of said, oh, but you should have gone here, or you should have done this, or actually I want to do this. And so they've either contributed an essay to Afropean.com, which is what I encourage people to do, because I run the website Afropean.com, where anybody can submit an essay and we'll edit it, and we accept most people's essays. And they can, somebody wrote a piece that was all about the countryside in Europe, because of course I was interested in kind of the metropole, but there's this whole other world that is rural Europe that needs to be explored, and I couldn't do that. Also, I think questions of gender and sexual politics as well. There could have been more of that in my book, but again, it's opening up that question. So I think hopefully what I'm getting is when it's entering certain territories, especially in Germany, actually, where it won this big award recently, the Leipzig book prize for European understanding. What I'm getting from the Black communities there is that's great. But actually, where is the love for the Black German writers who are many? And the hope is that this book is maybe a first step, and that there are many other scholars. There's much more work to come. I mean, some of the names that you mentioned at the beginning of this, and one of the amazing things with this book has been traveling around Europe, talking about these issues and connecting with other people. You mentioned Theo Imani, who used one of my images in Berlin, actually, as part of his work, where he's taking old Renaissance paintings and matching them with modern day images. So we've collaborated, and then Minna Salami, who was talking in Venice, she came over when we did an event in Amsterdam with Bernardine Evaristo, and I just interviewed her for the Afropean podcast, which is something we should probably talk about. That's the next thing that we're working on. So yeah, it was really the culmination of a lot of work that I've been doing with Afropean.com. I'm talking about the book here, but also a jump-off point into much wider discussions, and that to me is actually has been the most amazing thing, is that it's opened up, and of course there are many other scholars who are opening up this discussion as well. But I think the book has really played a part in hopefully opening up a space. And every time it wins an award, the hope is that this is an award for the Black community in Europe, and that it will encourage more awards and more writing, and show that people that that there is that it's sustainable. It's not all about awards, but what's great about an award is you get a certain amount of money, and you get that helps to fund further work, and also it increases awareness for your work, and it just makes your work more sustainable. So yeah, it's been a really interesting experience, and also a quite slow burn. When the book came out, it gathered a bit of press and it was okay, but it wasn't really until maybe a year later when it won the Jalak Prize that things started to pick up. Then it won a couple of other awards, and so it's been like a slow burn, which is exactly how I kind of wanted it. A word of mouth thing, which has been great.
Afropean.com, needless to say, the last year has been, because of the pandemic, very much a .com.org existence. We've gone digital, those of us who can afford to do that. Have you seen a specific impact on the, let's say, or any interesting development in the Afropean digital community that has been accelerated or enabled by this unique situation?
Well, I think it really opens up the possibility of communicating with each other. Like I think before, not necessarily the case, but I think people would try and meet in person. But I mean, I know this actually because I've been working on this Afropean podcast, and we were trying to travel to each location and get a real feeling for each city that we were in sonically. And then when we had to start doing it all through interviews on Zoom, we actually found that we could get more people involved, and that as long as somebody had an internet connection, we could include them on the podcast. And so I think that like there's actually been a lot more communication in lots of ways. And I mean, you mentioned there that, for those of us lucky enough to have an internet connection, we do have to be careful because, of course, there are people who don't have an internet connection, and we have to also not forget those people who just don't even. It's not just that they don't have an internet connection, but don't even think that spaces that at universities or in institutions that it's for them. And so for me, it's about trying to get that balance right. But I think broadly, I think that it's been a really interesting time in terms of organising, Black cultural spaces. I think that, long may it continue. Hopefully that will transfer back into the real world when we can all meet up again.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the real world, there's almost an epiphany in the book where you think you have found Afropia in a restaurant in Brussels, if I remember correctly. And I think that eating places are key sites in your book. Of course, you talk about monuments, you talk about official places and villas, but the place where you feel the sort of bustling, bubbling life of Afropia are typically this place of conviviality.
Yeah, exactly. And in many ways, this book goes through Paris and Brussels and Lisbon, but really it's not about Paris, Brussels or Lisbon. It's about, Cova da Moura in Lisbon. It's about Clichy-sous-Bois in Paris. It's about Matonge in Brussels. And I've been quoting this a lot recently, but I just think it's so beautiful. Toni Morrison, said that I stood at the edge, I stood at the border and claimed it as center, and for me, is what this journey was too. It was a chance to claim these spaces that are like the one I grew up in Sheffield. Firth Park was very multicultural, full of Yemenis and Jamaicans and Somalians, and as well as like a white working class community, and but was never a part of the mythology of Sheffield. And I know this because exactly where I grew up, they filmed this quite well-known film, The Full Monty, in the exact part of Sheffield where I grew up, but it, reduced it to a kind of working class white, community. But actually, it was much more than that, and they kind of wove that. That was woven out of the story in the end. So yeah, I wanted to look at these places and look at them as places of possibility and of conviviality. And that is really where I found if Afropia was anywhere, it was in these spaces. And like you said, in the civic realm, and I found that cities and areas that allowed people to encounter each other were the most successful, which is why Marseille for me still, despite all of its problems, is still a place that I see as a kind of Afropean Mecca. It's a place where I feel personally that I can apply the notion of Afropean in my everyday life in a really meaningful way, because it's kind of all around me, this kind of crazy mix of people all together, encouraged by the topography, encouraged by the geography, by these public spaces, by areas where you see a lot of graffiti. Some people get scared when they see a road covered in graffiti. For me, I know that's home. I will always walk down that street rather than the street without any graffiti, because I feel like that's where I know I can find something a bit. I can find the B side.
All right. So we have a few minutes left, and now I have to, spit it out. So I'm an Italian academic, and you both take issues with the way in which academics write about Blackness, but let's not talk about that, because I basically kind of tend to agree with you, all in all. But what interests me is why, if Italy had not appeared, I would not have said, all right, why not Italy? You cover so much space. You talk a lot about many different places, and there was no, I think, way that you could cover everything. But there is a very short interlude in Rome. So Rome is there, or maybe Vatican City is there. So one could say, in fact, that you have not dealt with Italy, you have dealt with another state. So the question is, could there be an Italian sequel to Afropean? Is there a way that you, in a different, you were a traveler that was, a not very famous young traveler, and now you're in a completely different position. But do you think there could be, or is there any plan for an Afropean 2 that would have even space for Italy?
Vittorio has to write it. That's the thing, is that yeah, of course. And especially when you have this issue with Libya and Sudan and the Mediterranean in general, and the crossings that happen, it's absolutely crucial. And it's weird. I could have said nothing, but Rome for me was actually a respite after Moscow. I'm feeling just exhausted and just like really sort of unsettled. I had to almost. I just couldn't take any more, and it was like I was running out of time, and Rome just became a place for me to recharge a little bit. And there was just this moment where I sort of almost thought, well, okay, in this area where my work is not as deep as the rest of the book, maybe I should actually talk about the fact that I was a tourist, and then even in that space of being a tourist, and kind of taking a step outside of the premise of the book, even there it was kind of, I couldn't entirely switch it off, and so going to Vatican City was fascinating for me, because I was at the heart of this kind of in some ways, this may be controversial, but of white supremacy, of the myth making of a white god, and so that was just a chance for me to talk about that. But I absolutely know, and of course, that there is a much deeper, richer story that places the Black community at the heart of it. But I would love someone like Vittorio Longhi or Theo Imani or some of the people, some of the great scholars that we all had dinner together, and I think maybe that story needs to come from somebody who is perhaps a little bit closer to the stories there, if it's just going to be about Italy, yeah.
Well, thank you for mentioning that, and personally, I think that what Vittorio Longhi and Ijaba Shego and Theo Imani are doing is invaluable. But I also think that the kind of perspective that you could bring would be absolutely invaluable. This is why I want to publicly, officially invite you to Venice, to come back. I think you should come here to be a writer and a photographer in residence, because I think that Venice is, with all due respect to Rome, and I hope that Vittorio and Ijaba are not listening now, but Venice is very special because it has all that historical depth and a Black presence in its, for instance, Renaissance art that is also celebrated in the beautiful poster that we've chosen for this edition of Afropean, but also has a lot of the contradictions that you expose in the book, and there are many stories that can be told. So we look forward to having you back. But I'd like to conclude with a beautiful image and phrase that you bring from Berlin, and that's on page 204 of your book, where you talk about the future of Europe. And you show how, in a way, a better understanding of Afropia is not only something that would serve a specific community, but in fact speaks to the future of Europe. You talk about a wonderful, very multi-ethnic family there. But I would like you to conclude a few remarks about how Afropia is not just a celebration of an invisible community, but in fact is really is about the future of Europe as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I often think that I'm only pro-black because I'm pro-equality, and so black politics for me is a way towards addressing the imbalance in the world, and this is the journey that I'm taking, and a kind of black politics is helping me get there. And I think that's what I was getting at with Afropean in a certain way. I describe my feeling about Europe at the beginning of this book. I paraphrase the poet Robert Frost, and I say, my quarrel with the continent is a lover's quarrel, because I live here and I want to take part in Europe. And this is nothing new. Frantz Fanon loved France. He wanted to be a part of France. When you look at Aimé Césaire and the Negritry poets, they actually wanted France and they wanted Europe to live up to everything that Europe says it is, And I think that's what I want to do with Afropean, is I want to, for me, knowing this history doesn't take away from Europe. It adds to Europe. It makes Europe a richer place. And if we can be honest about what Europe is, what it has done, then I think we have a better chance of moving forward together. And, however trite that might sound or cliche, I really do believe that us addressing this uncomfortable history sometimes and trying to work out a way to be integrated somehow, or even if it's just appreciating and respecting each other's differences, I think that's key. Somebody once said to me that the real language of Europe is the language of translation. And I actually think that you can apply that to culture as well. The cultural translation is, and we need to learn to be each other's translators.
Johny Pitts, thank you for this, wonderful. Sorry, the camera. This is really a fundamental book, I think. Thank you for a very rich, stimulating conversation, and thank you for providing, I think, the best conclusion we could hope for this 2021 edition of Afropean Bridges. We look forward to welcoming you back in Venice. Thank you so much.
I look forward to seeing you in person, Shaul. Thank you so much.